Go for it.
Hello, Sammy.
Hi, Gladys. How are
Good
you?
morning, everybody. Good
Morning.
morning. Today we are February 12, 2025, and we have a beautiful program with the Tikva Fund in the topic of Jewish political greatness. This is our fifth lecture of 2025, and it's about Spain, Portugal, Venice, the tragic life and legacy of Don Isaac Abravanel. Good morning, my name is Sandra Koukou. I am the chair of the Women's Learning Group of the Spanish and Portuguese. I just want to announce that next month, instead of the 12th of March, it will be the 19th of March, Wednesday, the many dreams of Menasseh ben Israel. Friends, there's a beautiful saying by Abraham Heschel. He says, "When I was young, I admired clever people. Now that I am old, I admire kind people." Our co-speaker today, Dr. David Bensoussan, is not only one of the kindest people you have ever met, but he's also one of the most brilliant. And we're so lucky to have him be our commentator today. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to our beautiful Gladys, who has given us this program alongside Rabbi Ornstein. And she met Dr. David Bensoussan at the Communauté Séfarade Unifiée du Québec a few years ago. Since then, he's been a regular speaker. He spoke to us about Spain and Morocco, so many beautiful topics. So Gladys, can you please read a little bit the bio of our speaker today?
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you. Hello, everybody. We are so happy to welcome you today to enjoy the program of the Women Learning Group of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue, Montreal. Today is Wednesday, February 12, 2025, 14 Shabbat 5785. We continue our program and we are proud to have our moderator today, Dr. David Bensoussan, who studied engineering at the Technion in Haifa, Israel, and got his PhD at McGill University in Montreal. He is professor of electrical engineering at the University of Quebec. Dr. David Bensoussan is an author of many books and was president of Communauté Séfarade Unifiée of Quebec from 2005 to 2009. Please enjoy our today's program, carefully prepared by Sandra Koukou, Chair of Women Learning Group of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue, Montreal.
Thank you, Gladys. We are joined now by Adelia Bensoussan, his beautiful wife, and I see Edmond Shaheen. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. So, Ksenia, can you share the musical piece that I found? Kuando el Rez from a Sephardic journey.
Absolutely. Oh, hold on. Sorry, I need to redo it. Sorry. Share sound. Yeah.
rey Nimrod al campo salía, miraba en el cielo y en la estrellería, vi una luz santa en la judería, que había de nacer Abraham avino, Padre querido, Padre bendito, luz de Israel. Abraham avino, Padre querido, Padre bendito, luz de Israel. La mujer de Terach quedó preñada, de día en día él le preguntaba, ¿de qué tenéis la cara tan demudada? Ella ya sabía el bien que tenía. Abraham avino, Padre querido, Padre bendito, luz de Israel. Abraham avino, Padre querido, Padre bendito, luz de Israel.
Cierto lo haremos al verdadero él, sabemos al compadre y también como él, que por sus difuntos venga el Noel, vivirá como Israel. Abraham avino, Padre querido, Padre bendito, luz de Israel. Abraham avino, Padre querido, Padre bendito, luz de Israel. Abraham avino, Padre querido, Padre bendito, luz de Israel. Abraham avino, Padre querido, Padre bendito, luz de Israel.
Thank you, Ksenia. So, Dr. Bensoussan, the floor is yours. Bechavot.
You? Okay, so I'd like to share my screen.
Sure.
Okay. Well, who can share? Okay. I don't know. I've been asked questions that I don't have the answers. Okay, so the time is short and the topic is fascinating. There's so many things to say, not only about the period, but also about the personality of Isaac Abravanel. And what I'll try to do in this prelude to the next lecture is simply put in context the man and his period. So we first draw a tableau of historical context, Moors versus Catholics in Spain, followed by the gradual anti-Jewish measures in Christian Spain, and the Sephardic Marando diaspora, because Don Isaac Abravanel lived exactly in Spain. He lived through the exile in 1492, and later on continued in the diaspora, mainly in Italy. Okay, historical context. In 711, the Moors conquered Spain. The Moors were a mixture of Arabs and Berbers, which conquered Spain. And sometime later, somebody who was from the Umayyad dynasty from Damascus, whose family has been killed by all the new Abbasid dynasty, arrived in Spain and became Caliph. And then starts really what we call the golden age, because at the time the creation, musical, literature, philosophy was blooming, and there was a kind of happiness all over. People refer to this period as the golden age of Sephardic Jewry. But through history, we'll see that this won't be the case, because the Moors conquered Spain but left Asturias in the north. They left part unconquered, and from this part, kingdoms started to grow. Leon, Castilla, Aragon, Saragossa, and more in the Christian part, and many more in the south, which means that in 1031 already there was not a unified caliphate. There were many kingdoms. So through history, the Christian advance regularly towards the south, okay, until at the end they get to the Adriatic Sea around 1450. There was only the kingdom of Granada at the south and Castilla and Aragon on the rest. I'd like to just say something about it. During this period, there were battles between Christians and Moors, but again, one side wins, then he captures people, sells them as slaves. The other one captures people, sells them as slaves. It's a kind of modus vivendi. People were used to go back and forth along the Mesa, along the Sierra of Spain. But things are going to happen that are going simply to create a big problem. General picture is the following. If in 1063, the Franks came and massacred the whole city, 8,000 people completely, no prisoners, no slavery, no nothing. And that was a big shock in Spain. At the same time, that was a prelude to the Crusades that lasted almost 200 years in the Holy Land. And another invasion of Spain by the Almohad. Almohad is al-Muwahhidin, Wahid, that means one religion, one book, and the rest has to be burned, including the people, not only the books. And that was a period of intolerance. Then you had a few crises. You had the Black Death in Europe, and somebody in Chinon, Switzerland, decided that in order to exercise this Black Death, they have to burn Jews, which they did in a few places. In Strasbourg, they burned the Jews, but they left a beautiful woman. They didn't burn them. There were pogroms in 1391, on which we will come back, because during these pogroms, that's where the grandfather, Isaac Abravanel, converted to Spain and fled to Portugal and became Jewish there again. You had religious controversies between rabbis and priests to see whose theology is righteous. And at the same time, you have a lot of unions of Christian kingdoms gathering together, while Muslims were divided in many kingdoms, mostly between Berbers and Arabs, and sometimes within the kingdom itself. And you had also a lot of tension between papacy and royalty, because the Pope thought he was the big boss of the kings, and kings were not always happy about that. Another important event was the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which was a big shock in the whole Christian world, because Constantinople was Byzantium, which was the second Rome. It was conquered by the Ottomans. Then you have the establishment of the Inquisition in Spain, after many negotiations between the Pope and the kings, and you had the expulsion in 1492. Okay, just to have an idea, what you see here is the map of the Crusades. You see there's many periods where Crusaders went to Holy Land. Many times they went to Constantinople, and it was so rich and so beautiful they stayed there and forgot about the Holy Land. But that lasted almost 200 years. This is the Almohad conquest, and Muwahhidin, as I said, conquered North Africa until Libya and continued here and terrorized the whole Spain. Now, what happened that led to the Inquisition? You have to know, first of all, that the church was considered itself Verus Israel, the true Israel. That means there's the Old Testament, which is completely dead, and there's a New Testament, which is the truth. But what happens if you have Jews who call themselves Israel and stick to the Old Testament? So who's really the inheritor of the alliance with God? Is it the church or the Jews? If it's the Jews, then the church would be so-called bastard or something. They couldn't stand the idea. Anyway, that was the basis of this jealousy from the church. And you have Pope Urban this reflection of the Pope says a lot, because in Christian Spain, they tried to rebuild the glory of the culture of the Moorish Spain, called many Jews and Muslims as translators, as artists, and so on. And when of the kings died, the Pope said, believers may rejoice of the death of this tyrant who rose against the church and favored Muslims and Jews. The righteous rejoice at the punishment inflicted upon the wicked. Very happy that the king, who was sympathetic to Jews and Muslims, died. In 1412 already, there were some professions prohibited to Jews, especially anything has to do with agriculture and food, owning lands, and Talmudic works were confiscated. 1478 is the Inquisition and the persecution of the Jews, which, by the way, enriched the church. We'll see that when people were condemned, then you'll have tortures, and you'll have eventually people lose everything, all they own versus the church. The religious controversies were many of them. It started in Paris in 1242, Barcelona, and Tortosa. The one of Barcelona lasted 4 days, the one Tortosa 20 months of debates. And the king, which is in the middle of the picture here, basically was very admired, very much Nachmanid, Haramban, that led the Jewish group. And at the end, Haramban had to flee Spain, and he went to the Holy Land and opened a synagogue in Jerusalem. It still exists today. One of the problems that the church had was simply the converts. The converts that simply converted for excuse me a second. People converted for conveniency and stay Jews. So in one of the books of the period, it says, in the city of Seville, the investigator said to the governor, if our Lord wishes to know how to identify converts who observe the Sabbath, let us climb to the top of the tower. It's enough to identify the houses from which no smoke emerges, even in winter. And it was followed by a big massacre in 1391, 4,000 dead. And that's at this time, that's where the grandfather of Abravanel left for Portugal. The massacres of 1391 continued in many cities, Sevilla, Madrid, Cordoba, Toledo, Burgos, and so on. And there was the first exile of Jews that went to Morocco, to Provence in the south of France, to Algiers and Constantinople. 1449, a new kind of discrimination against Jews started. Even if you converted, you're not a real Christian, you're a nouveau Christian. That means you're not a real Christian because you have Jewish blood. And this racist consideration led to more persecutions directly. We're getting to a point where Isabella of Castilla has bigger part of Spain, and Ferdinand Aragon is on the right, as you can see here. And they both get married, and Christian Spain get united. What they call les rois catholiques, the Catholic kings. So they put their court in Sevilla, and in Sevilla, as you can see, was a Moorish place. You can see here the mosques, the Giralda, transformed into a church, which is what happened everywhere in Spain that was conquered. Now, what did Inquisition wanted? You had the choice. If you are accused, you have to confess, and then you are strangled before being burnt. And if you don't confess, you're burnt alive. 10,000 people or so were burnt, and even Marranos, which died and suspected of being, not really Christians, were exhumed and burnt. Problem is, the person never know who is the accuser. It could be a neighbor, it could be a competitor, it could be a business partner. You never know who accused you. You all you had to do is confess. And what you had to do in order to accuse someone of being not being a real Christian, if he fasts on Purim, if he's whispering before drinking wine, if he's wearing better clothes on the Sabbath, and so on. And that way, to get people to confess, you had a lot of tortures. In one of my books, I give the details. It's no fun, but you had procession auto da fe, where people simply were conducted to be burnt on the stake. In 1488, there was an accusation of a child abduction, and they used this pretext in order simply to say, well, it's impossible to have Jews among us. And Torquemada was the chief inquisitor, decided on put pressure in order to chase Jews from Spain. 1492, Granada was conquered. That was the last kingdom. You see here the Moorish kingdom giving the key to the city. The mother of the Moorish king told him, go and cry like a woman. What didn't succeed in defending as a man? And the kings went into Granada, and this is a palace of Alhambra that exists still today. It's interesting that this palace have not been destroyed. Everything else has been destroyed. Millions of manuscripts in Arabic are destroyed. Most of the philosophers of the Arabs their works have been saved by Hebrews. It's Arabic written in Hebrew letters, but they simply wanted to erase the souvenir of Moorish Spain. Even the hammam, they closed the hammam because it's a Moorish habit. So it couldn't wash because it's a Moorish habit. So this is some more picture of Alhambra, still in Granada. So you see the church is imposing itself directly. And we get to the expulsion. The expulsion in 1492. The objective was simply to have one kingdom, one people, one culture, one religion. It reminds us the Almohad formulas that exist at the end. And they wanted to remove the Jewish influence over the new Christians. So they wanted the new Christians to stay Christians. At that time, Don Isaac Abravanel and Abraham Senior went to the Spanish court and defended the Jews and wanted to cancel this edict or postpone it or something. They did not succeed. Abraham Senior was 80 years old, converted, and Don Isaac Abravanel refused. In fact, they proposed to him, okay, the Jews will be away, but you can stay with 9 Jews, so you'll have a million, you can continue to be in the court. He says, absolutely not, I'm leaving. So Isaac Abravanel offered the king a large sum of money if it would revoke the Alhambra decree. The king hesitated, but when Torquemada found that the offer, he barged in the presence of Ferdinand and Isabella, threw a crucifix before their feet, and asked if they were going to betray their Lord for money like Judas has done. So Abravanel could not save the Jews. And Jews are leaving, according to Abravanel, around 300,000. It was not like going to Florida. It was tough. There were many pirates in the Mediterranean, and Jews managed to escape. 3 kings allowed them to receive Morocco, Naples, and Constantinople. That's where they went. Later on, the Jews from Spain, which went to Portugal, became the Spanish Portuguese Jews. They'll go to Holland, to England, and eventually to America. The Sultan of Constantinople was very happy, and he said, how can you call Ferdinand a wise monarch, he who has impoverished his empire and enriched mine? And Jews settled in the Balkans, in Mediterranean, and they kept languages, Judaismo, Spaniolit, Requetia, and Ladino for services. And even the name, you can see that the name Toledano is from Toledo, Castiel is from Castilla, and so on and so on. So they kept their Spanish identity somehow. Now let's talk about Abravanel. There's a lot to say because he was a statesman, finance minister of Portugal and Spain, philosopher, Bible commentator, community leader, and more. Okay, his family, as I said, originated from Sevilla. They moved to Cordoba. Grandfather was a tax collector. Now, being a tax collector was like the highest posts in the government because you had to supply the king with money and you had to collect taxes without being, so to say, hated. And somehow he manages to very well to do that, the grandfather. So will do Abravanel in Portugal. In Portugal, he studied Latin classes, rabbinic literatures, and he belonged to an influential circle with direct access to the king. So his rabbinic education, he was a Bible scholar, a lot of philosophy. He wrote a commentary by Maimonides, by the way. And he was extremely versed, not only in scriptures, but non-Judaic sources at the time. So he served as a Jewish community leader under King Alfonso. He managed to raise a huge sum of money to liberate 250 Jews from Arzila in Morocco, which were captured and sold as slaves. So what you call Pidion Shvuim, he just brought them back. He fled to Portugal after being accused of planning a coup with his business partner. Business partner wanted to have a coup, and they accused Abravanel, so somehow not. So he wrote a lot. He got back to Spain and wrote a lot. We say that he wrote 6 books in 6 months. He touches as many topics as we'll see in a moment. And by the way, some of his books you can see at the Jewish Library in Montreal in the archives. And today we have many of his books which are reprinted, both in English, all his works, and both in Hebrew. So from there he went to Venice. Okay. He did not accept the complete fusion of faith and reason of Maimonides, because he says you cannot explain creation that way, and there should be something supernatural in the creation, and there's supernatural force in the world. So there were differences between Maimonides and him. He wrote Bible commentaries, and he had a very sharp eye. Okay. Give you a small example of what he does. He say, let's say God created heaven and earth. Well, in the beginning, what will have to be created once he created heaven and earth? What's left to create? Is it the complete existence? Why the angels, spiritual beings, are not mentioned in this creation? And since everything was created through speech, what does first act? God said, let there be a heaven and an earth. Okay. It doesn't say that. God separated the light from the darkness. What does that mean? Did the light existed before darkness? The darkness before light? All kind of questions. He keeps digging nonstop. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light. Well, maybe it should be God separated the light from the darkness, and God saw the light was good. Instead, there was an evening and there was morning. He says, no, there was night, there was day. Why it doesn't say that? And you see what questions keep going at every word, every verse, every paragraph. How come it says second day, third day, fourth day, and first day it says day 1 and not first day? And he keeps asking more questions. I'm not saying that he answers all the questions he asks, but definitely it's a very sharp eye on the scriptures. Now, after the exile, somehow Spain inherited the Holy Roman Empire, which is basically all you can see here in Germany, Holland, okay, and also later on Naples, the Kingdom of Naples. And Abravanel fled to Naples and became the treasurer for the King of Naples. But after 2 years, in 1494, the French conquered Naples, and therefore he had to flee, and he went to a few places before settling to Venice. Something very important. At the time, Europe was getting its spices through the Far East. As you can see here, the spices went through mostly Arabia, North Africa, and so on. But each time they go to somewhere, there'll be a tax and a tax and a tax and a tax. So the spices were extremely expensive. So Abravanel said, that Vasco da Gama now find the road to India through the sea. We don't need to pay all those taxes. All we need to send boats back and forth. And he suggested to Venice to organize this business. So Venetians told him, okay, you go to Portugal, where he was theoretically condemned to death. And you said that. Obviously, it didn't go away, but somehow there was another Jewish person, Dona Gracia Mendoza, that simply monopolized the spice business, and she was the richest person on earth. And her son-in-law, Don Yosef Nassi, started to build settlements in Israel at the time around Tiberias. But that's out of there. There's much more to say, but I'll leave that for the question period. Thank you.
For me to share, you have to stop sharing screen.
We're right away.
You have to stop sharing your screen.
And okay, my screen.
Hold on, let me
Okay.
see. I can do it. It's okay. I'll do it.
Okay.
Israel Meir Lau, the former chief rabbi of Israel and the youngest survivor of Buchenwald, describes in his memoir the celebration in the camp of one of the most joyous days of the Jewish calendar, taking place in the midst of the most terrible conditions imaginable. He writes about Buchenwald as follows. Purim arrived. As with Passover, the Jews in Buchenwald decided to celebrate Purim as best they could. They could not fulfill the mitzvot of sending portions of food to friends, giving gifts to the poor, or holding a festive meal. But they could attempt to read the scroll of Esther. No one had a Megillah, a scroll, yet they did not concede defeat. Several days before the date, some of the older Jews in the camp held a meeting. They resolved to shake off their despair and try to reconstruct the Megillah from memory. Each man would write whatever verses he remembered by heart, and a committee of the elders of the block would try to reconstruct the proper order of the text. Everyone remembered the most important verses, such as, in the days of Achashverosh, for the Jews there was light and happiness, joy and glory. There was a Jewish man in Shushan the capital whose name was Mordechai, and Mordechai would not kneel or bow. They wrote out the verses with charcoal on yellow paper torn from discarded sacks of millet. On Purim Eve, writes Rabbi Lau, the Jews of Buchenwald read the improvised scroll. They could not recite the blessing since the scroll was incomplete and not written on parchment, and thus did not fulfill the conditions of the law. Still, with whatever they had dredged up from the depths of their memories, they managed to create a traditional Purim atmosphere, albeit modest due to the circumstances. At the end of the evening, the Jews sang the symbolic lines, charged with meaning. Shoshanat Yaakov tzahala v'samecha. The rose of Jacob rejoiced and exulted. Chuatam hayita lanetzach. You have always been their salvation, their hope in every generation. All who place hope in you, God, shall not be put to shame, nor shall all those who trust in you be disgraced forever. Writes Rabbi Lau, when they sang, Cursed is Haman who sought to destroy me, no one had any doubt to whom the verse referred, and the phrase, Blessed is Mordechai the Jew, inspired everyone with great hope. End quote. What does it mean to mark a holiday when your life is anything but that? How can one celebrate Purim when every single day of your life is nothing other than Tisha B'Av, the day of mourning in the Jewish calendar? Even more profoundly, how can one maintain faith in all that Purim proclaims when your own experience appears to belie that belief? How can you say with Mordechai, Revach v'hatzalal yamod la'Yehudim, that salvation will arise for the Jews when that salvation does not seem to come? And how can you rejoice in the memory of a Haman's decree that was averted, when you yourself are the victim of a modern Haman whose decrees against the Jews brought unimaginable disaster? If there is a man who faced this question in the centuries before the Second World War, it was Don Isaac Abravanel. In all the annals of Jewish history, it is difficult to find someone like him, a man who served in courts throughout Europe while emerging as one of the seminal Torah scholars of Jewish history. But he is also, and perhaps first and foremost, someone who led a community at one of its most terrible moments, and was tasked with sustaining their faith during an experience that was beyond imagining. It so happens that thanks to the schedule we've set up for our Statesmanship series, we turn to the tale of Abravanel as Jews around the world prepare for Purim. And this was utterly unintentional and perhaps purely coincidental, and yet the very message of Purim appears to be that there is no coincidence. And as we shall see, it is this belief that lay at the heart of Abravanel's own worldview. I will argue today that the story of Purim, rightly understood, is at the heart of Abravanel's story, in ways that are both terribly tragic and also immensely inspiring. In engaging Abravanel's story, I will draw on the remarkable biography by the historian Benzion Netanyahu, and my citations of Abravanel in translation are from him, except for I'm quoting and translating from the Hebrew directly. In this spirit, without intending in any way to cause any controversy or take any position whatsoever on the matter, I will be utilizing Netanyahu's preferred pronunciation of the name Abravanel, rather than Abarbanel. I understand how people take the specifics of rabbinic names very seriously. There is, of course, some who spell, for example, the name Soloveitchik with a T. I've told my students in college that this is not a big deal either, except that if they spell my name with a T, they will receive an F in the course. But hopefully we will derive lessons from Abravanel's life that are far beyond the specifics of his name. I must also say that the political experiences and intellectual writings of Abravanel are so vast that a true appraisal in a single lecture is absolutely impossible. And thus, I am first and foremost focusing on aspects of his life that speak to me. But this cannot sufficiently summarize the astonishing experiences and achievements of this man. And so we begin. Today, the very name Abravanel, or Abravanel, is synonymous with political heroism and spiritual and intellectual excellence. But we cannot appreciate the figure that we study this evening without understanding that before him, before the name Abravanel became known for spiritual greatness, it was by Jews in Spain associated with apostasy. The patriarch of the Abravanel family, Isaac Abravanel's grandfather, Don Samuel, a prominent figure among the Jews of Spain, converted to Christianity long before the expulsion. The precise cause of the conversion is unknown, but as Netanyahu notes, scholarship has disproven what was once taken for granted, that he had been forced in some way. As Netanyahu has it, quote, "What we know is that he never returned to Judaism, that he devoted himself strictly to his social rise and the amassing of a great fortune, that he reached the highest stations in the king's financial service, and that many of his offspring intermarried with Spain's nobles," end quote. This means that there was from the very beginning a terrible rift in the family, with some of the children of Don Samuel fleeing the stain of their father's choice. And it is this that motivated one of his oldest children, Don Judah Abravanel, one of Don Samuel's oldest children, to make his way to Portugal. Even though he escaped from Spain and from the Spanish Jewish community and from the stain of scandal, there is no question that nevertheless his father's painful legacy would have weighed greatly on him, and therefore on his son, their entire life. But if Don Judah left behind his father's conversion, he did not in Portugal leave behind the family vocation of serving kings. Don Judah Abravanel took up the service of the Portuguese monarch Alfonso V, and that of a noble family, the house of the Duke of Braganza. From his courtier father, Abravanel would have received, as Netanyahu notes, along with a training in Torah, an education in the entire intellectual tradition of the West, meaning he would have received whatever education that courtiers and nobility were receiving. As he entered adulthood, Isaac Abravanel served both Alfonso and the Duke's family in both the financial and political sphere. And it is clear that for the Braganzas, Isaac Abravanel, was considered indispensable. In Netanyahu's words, quote, "We do not know what services Abravanel rendered in the management of their tremendous fiefs, but he must have fulfilled some vital tasks, for we know that he was compensated in abundant measure. He himself, Abravanel, became the owner of vast estates, some of which came to him in all likelihood as gifts from his grateful and magnanimous friends." So rendered this way, Abravanel could be seen as akin to other court Jews in Jewish history. But here, ladies and gentlemen, is where it gets really interesting. What we find between Isaac Abravanel and the noble family of Braganza is more than an association of mutual self-interest. It is a genuine friendship. Testament can be found to that in a moving letter that Abravanel wrote to the son of the Duke, the Count of Faro, consoling him following the death of his father-in-law. Abravanel speaks to him of mourning, commiseration, and guides him, his noble friend, from his sorrow back to life, back to engagement with the world. And as you read the letter, you realize this is not merely a courtier consoling the man he serves. This is not a yes man attempting to buck up his boss. This is a friend consoling a friend. And, if I may speak a little anachronistically, this is nothing less than a rabbi engaging in pastoral counseling. Only he's doing it with a Christian nobleman in Portugal. Abravanel, as we shall see, refers even in his Hebrew writings, when he's writing for Jews, and when Portugal was in the past, to the incredible affection that existed between himself and the Braganzas. I recently had the pleasure in my synagogue of convening a reunion between descendants of Abravanel with the current Duke of Braganza, His Royal Highness Duarte Pio João Miguel Gabriel Rafael. That's all one person. That's his name. Now, I watch Downton Abbey, and I enjoy hosting a duke as much as the next person. But the reason I did it, and what I wish to highlight, was together with the synagogue when we hosted him, and the Barbanels, as they called themselves, as they still call themselves, these descendants of a Barbanel, what I wish to highlight was the humanism that this friendship embodied. We touch then on an astonishing irony that a man whose life will become bound up with the story of anti-Semitism and the horrible havoc that it will wreak in the life of in the story of the Jewish people, this very same man in the life that he lived testifies in small moments of his career to the possibility of genuine fellowship between Jew and Gentile. This was, therefore, in Portugal, a golden moment in his life. Power, wealth, and fellowship with the Gentile ruling class, unlike that experienced by most Jews in diaspora history. And then suddenly, it all went up in smoke. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik has commented that the story of Purim is marked by the celebration of Purim, is marked by a preceding fast. Because at the heart of our celebration is also something fearful. The terrifying reminder that the moment Jews find relative freedom, even influence in the diaspora, anywhere, they can suddenly lose it all. On Purim we celebrate V'nahapochu, that all was reversed, but reversal can go the other way. And that for Abravanel is exactly what happened. In 1483 a new king took the throne, John II, who turned against the Duke of Braganza, his relative. And then the new king also set his sights on the loyal Jewish steward of the House of Braganza. As Abravanel put it, he was targeted by the new Portuguese king. Yan miyemei kedem kadmata biyamim harishonim hayta avati atzuma et hasarim hanidafim ha'ela. Because he writes, and he's writing this for Jews, for many years my love was very fierce for the nobles that were pursued, for the Braganza family. So consider the reversal, ladies and gentlemen, that has occurred here. The very same historically exceptional friendship. For Abravanel, love was not too strong a word. Between Jew and Christian, between Abravanel and Braganza, that friendship, so incredible, so exceptional, became the very source of the danger that presented itself to Abravanel. He was forced to flee, leaving his home, his writings, his sources of study, and all his wealth and property. He sought sanctuary in Spain, and the man who was the model of Jewish achievement in Portugal arrived on Spanish soil with nothing to his name, or as he put it in Jewish legal terms, Vayikach et kol asher li, karkai agav metaltali, ad beli hishir li, sarid. The king of Portugal took from my family all I had, my land and my possessions, till I had not a speck remaining. And as he tells us in his own account, at that moment, having lost everything, Abravanel asked God, why had he done this to him? Hashofet kol haaretz, he cried, lo yaseh mishpat. Shall not the judge of the world do justice? And it is Abravanel's response to this very question that he raised that is remarkable. Because Abravanel could have merely denounced what fate had brought upon him. He could have said that perhaps he had not been favored to receive God's providence, that all had happened according to chance. But Abravanel instead assumed that there was no coincidence here. God, he assumed, must be punishing him. There must be a lesson to be learned, an atonement that was asked of him. And then Abravanel seized on a sin. He had, as a young man, absorbed the Torah, but he had not taught it. Lo darashta me'al sefer Hashem lishmoa balimudim. You, he says to himself, you did not teach from the scroll of God. And then I realized, he writes, Tov li torat picha me'alfei zahav v'chesef, that God's Torah is more exquisite than the multitudes of gold and silver. And so right there in Castile, right over the border of Spain, he begins to lecture to the Jews that are there, and then, as Netanyahu puts it, quote, seized by a creative urge of a strength and intensity he had never felt before, he begins to write. And for the next several weeks, the words of the Torah pour forth from within him. He wrote his commentary on Joshua in 2 weeks, on Judges in less than a month, and then commentary on both books of Samuel in 100 days. This man has lost everything. He has no library, no funds, no source of sustenance, yet the Torah is still within him. The Torah traveled with him. The Torah pours forth from him. And if you have read Abravanel's commentary, you would understand how extraordinary is what came forth. The joke about Abravanel's writings is that They always create heretics throughout history because his discussion of every biblical passage or chapter begins with a series of many, many questions, which he only then addresses and answers in a very lengthy manner. And many, the joke says, just give up after so many questions. They're overcome by the questions and just give up on Judaism itself. That's a joke, of course. But if you actually study the length of it, you see how remarkable is the fact that he produced all of this on Joshua, Judges, and Samuel in 4.5 months. In this time, Netanyahu writes, quote, within 4.5 months, he produced 4 large volumes comprising 400,000 words. And as Netanyahu puts it, this is perhaps the first and only time that the political books of the Bible was interpreted by a statesman. So all this Abravanel does as a response to a purported providential punishment of exile from Portugal. And the events that followed immediately after appear to confirm his own theological reading of his fortune. Abravanel had assumed that he had lost political power due to his abstaining from teaching Torah. And suddenly, upon teaching Torah, he is introduced to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. It must have seemed to him as if he had read the mind of God, for he was launched again on success, serving the crown and a noble family, the House of Mendoza. Just like in Portugal, all was restored as it was, seemingly. Surely he has read God's intentions correctly. Abravanel, Netanyahu writes, quote, retained and apparently increased his holdings in the royal tax farming system, and commanding large profits from his multiple enterprises, he could now make loans comprising millions of marvedis to the queen and the war treasurer of state from 1488 on. He felt he was standing in royal favor, appreciation, and esteem. By 1491, he became the Queen's personal financial representative, end quote. So Abravanel appeared to be on the brink of another golden age in his life, never apparently expecting the terrible disaster that was yet to come. Because the announcement of the expulsion edict of 1492 came as a shock to Spain's Jews. It is, in retrospect, shocking that he was shocked. After all, the Inquisition was already persecuting and torturing conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity before the threatened expulsion, and who were accused by the Church of covert Jewish observance. Yet the Jews, including the great Abravanel, writes Netanyahu, quote, did not read the signs of the time. And thus, when the expulsion edict was eventually announced, it was, for Spanish Jewry, quote, like a thunderbolt out of the clear sky, tumbling at last the walls of illusions behind which the Jews of Spain lived, end quote. So why, Netanyahu asks, why did Jews not sense the vicious hatred that was festering? And why did they not take the Inquisition's anti-Semitic activity more seriously? Netanyahu suggests that the Jews of Spain incorrectly assumed that the Inquisition was concerned solely with the religious beliefs of those who identified as Christians. But the way the Inquisition spoke about the Jews should have alerted the Jewish community to the Church's ultimate aims. The Inquisition spoke of the polluting blood of the Jews of Spain and of the Jewish character that they called sinister, from which Spanish Christians must be protected. This is all described by Netanyahu, and I've written elsewhere about Netanyahu's history and his understanding of Abravanel in this context. Yet the Jews, as Netanyahu argues, chose to see the Inquisition as motivated only by a crusading Christian fervor and not by a deeper hatred of the Jewish people. The most peculiar aspects of the years leading up to the expulsion, writes Netanyahu, is the fact that, quote, the Inquisition, instead of serving as a warning, contributed to a deceptive sense of peace, end quote. All this is Netanyahu's argument that I'm citing. For Bensoussan Netanyahu, Spanish Jewry's complacency and their embrace of a convenient narrative reveals what he calls, quote, man's natural reluctance to draw radical conclusions which imply uprooting oneself from a comfortable spot. Just as German Jews, quote, failed to foresee Hitler's rise to power at any time during the period preceding that rise, so the Jews of Spain failed to notice, even a few years before the expulsion, the mountainous waves which was approaching to overwhelm them, end quote. The failure by one of the greatest communities in Jewish diaspora history, the Jews of Spain, to sense this threat was for Netanyahu, quote, nothing short of proverbial. Then the edict is announced. Jews must convert or leave. At this point, all efforts by the Jews privileged to have a place in the Spanish court focused on reversing this decree. These Jews were primarily three: Abravanel, Abraham Senior, and Signor's son-in-law, Meir Melamed. The Jewish community appears to have been confident, as Netanyahu recounts, in the ability of Abravanel and his colleagues to avert their doom. And an enormous sum was offered to Ferdinand, but to no avail. Abravanel then turns to Queen Isabella and speaks as a Jewish hero. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is one moment that I would so dearly desire, if I could pick moments in Jewish diaspora history, to have been a fly on the wall for this scene. Abravanel stood before Isabella and spoke from his heart. Here is how Netanyahu describes what he said, quote, "He spoke now like a scion of the house of David and as a representative of an unconquerable and unconquered people. An unconquered and unconquerable people. He spoke to her, moreover, like a prophet of old, in daring, castigating, and threatening language. If Isabella thought that by measures like expulsion the Jews could be brought down, she was greatly mistaken. He pointed out to her, writes Netanyahu, the eternity of the Jewish people, that it was beyond human capacity to destroy the Jewish people, and that those who tried to do so only invited upon themselves divine punishment and disaster." End quote. This is what he said before the Queen of Spain. The king and queen resisted his rhetoric and successfully prevailed on Abraham Signor and Meir Melamed to convert to Christianity, as did their entire family. The king and queen sought to attain Abravanel's conversion as well, and one can only imagine the pressure that he experienced, to which we shall return. But he steadfastly refused. Many Jews did convert. Many did not. Many loyal Jews turned to Portugal, but this was not an option for Abravanel, for he was still a wanted man there, and so to Italy he turned. But I would like to add a point here, ladies and gentlemen. And that is that I suspect that this was even more crushing than historians often recount. Because upon entering in exile again, Abravanel did as he had previously done when dealt a crushing blow by life. He turned to Torah. And one of the commentaries he wrote was on the Book of Kings. And in his preface to this commentary, he gives an account of how he attempted to prevent the expulsion. And as always, his writing is filled with biblical allusions. But often here, when you read this account, it is allusion specifically to the book of Esther, the book of Esther that stands out. He describes how the decree came about. And he mentions that this occurred Be'et, and he tried to work against it. Be'et hayotisham ani bachatzar beit hamelech. At the time when I was in the courtyard of the king. This is a phrase from the book of Esther. He's describing himself as a Jew in the royal court like Mordechai. And then in seeking the help of Christian nobility to avert the decree, he writes how karati lemahevai ro'ei pnei hamelech levakesh alami. I call to my friends who see the face of the king to request mercy for my people. Here too, these are phrases taken directly from the book of Esther. This is exactly what Mordechai asked Esther to do, levakesh al-ama, to plead for her people. And then he writes, when all of his pleading and activism proved no avail, he continues, uvechol makom asher dvar hamelech v'dato magia, Evel gadol Yehudim. In every place where the words of the king reached, there was great mourning by the Jews, meaning of the Jews in Spain. This is, of course, also a direct phrase from the book of Esther. And in the use of this phrase, there is, of course, a terrible irony, because in Esther, this phrase appears as the initial reaction to Haman's decree, which is, of course, ultimately reversed, so that then the Megillah could say that in all places where the word of the king reached, there was joy among the Jews. Here, however, the mourning is the finality in Spain. It is mourning for what is about to come, the decree that cannot be averted. Abravanel was living a life of Mordechai. He was in the king's court. But the truth is that in every Purim existence hovers the potential for Tisha B'Av. It's interesting that in some Jewish traditions of trup, cantillation, the tune for reading, the book of Esther is read in a tune that's not all that different and somewhat close to the tune that we use when we read from the book of Lamentations on the 9th of Av. And when the phrase alluded to by Abravanel is actually read in the book of Esther, for this tradition the reader suddenly shifts slightly into a full-blown 9th of Av tune, so that the verse of mourning amidst the Jews of Persia is recited as if it were not from Esther but from Lamentations. Evel gadol laYehudim v'tzomu v'chi u'misbeid. As if suddenly what's being described is a story not of Jewish salvation but Jewish destruction, as if we're marking not Purim but Tisha B'Av. And indeed, with Abravanel, though he desperately sought salvation, it is destruction that occurred. And as he concludes his account by describing the book of the exile that took place, he alludes to the book of Esther. Vayelchu b'lo choach 300,000 ragli ha'am asher anochi b'kirbo minar va'ad zakein taf v'nashim b'yom echad mikol medinot hamelech. And they went without strength 300,000 Jews by foot, and in their midst from young to old, children and women in one day in all the provinces of the king. Again, these phrases, minar v'atzakein, b'yom echad, b'chol medinot hamelech, all these Hebrew phrases are from the book of Esther. This is the biblical description of Haman's plot. And indeed, it is according to Abravanel, on or around the 9th of Av, that the final expulsion from Spain occurred. So we have this joining of the story of the book of Esther and Tisha B'Av, Purim to lamentation. The intentional allusions to Esther's story in Abravanel's personal account may seem insignificant, but perhaps the citations of the Shushan story, ladies and gentlemen, are intentional, and I believe they are instructive, poignant, and profound. What he's perhaps hinting to us is what he had hoped for, what he had initially believed. The story of Purim is of Jews who were providentially placed in the court of the king in order to seek the salvation of their people. Abravanel had every reason to assume that this was his own destiny to serve in just such a capacity. For imagine, ladies and gentlemen, imagine if you had grown up assuming you were to spend your life in the service of Portugal, its king and nobility, only to lose it all. Imagine wondering why this occurred, what plan God has in store for you. Imagine that you then suddenly end up in the court of Spain, of Ferdinand and Isabella, having spent the past several years accruing power and influence, and then suddenly a decree is issued against your people. How could you not believe that the stage has been set by God for a second Purim story, one in which you, Isaac Abravanel, are called to serve as the Mordecai and Esther of Jewish history? How could you not say to yourself, how could Abravanel have not said to himself, as Mordecai did to his cousin Esther, Mi yodea im la'et kazot higat lamalchut. Perhaps for this very reason, Providence has placed you in the court of the king. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, thinking that your destiny is to be known in history as a second Mordecai. And it turns out that you will become instead the Mordecai who failed to avert the Spanish Haman's decree. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, the emotional impact that this must have had on him. He had hoped for a Purim, and he ends up with a 9th of Av. He had hoped to be Mordecai, and it turns out that he's the Mordecai who failed to avert the decree. Consider the distress that he must have experienced. Ponder the pain that must have coursed through him as he may have asked himself, why am I living a Purim tale in reverse? And there is more. Part of the grandeur of the tale of Esther and Mordecai is that they are descendants of a failed family. They are of the house of Shaul, the monarchy that did not succeed, King Saul. And it is Saul's failures against Haman's ancestor, the Amalekite Agag, for which Saul lost the throne. Soon Saul's family became known not only for failure, but treason. Mordecai and Esther themselves are named in the Megillah as descendants of Shimei, the man of Saul's family who refused to recognize David's sovereignty, who shamed King David in public and who was ultimately put to death by Solomon. It is not too much to say that Mordecai and Esther were descendants of a sort of Jewish Benedict Arnold. And the tale of Purim is one of Mordecai and Esther not only saving the Jews, but also saving their family name. And here too, in Abravanel's case, his family had left a generation before from Spain, leaving in shame when his grandfather had converted. Now the stage seemed to be set for the Jews of Spain to forever associate the name of Abravanel with the salvation of the Jews. Abravanel had every reason to expect a providential Purim. He had hoped for a Purim, and he received Tisha B'Av instead. And thus it was around Tisha B'Av they sailed, and an Italian historian cites a witness of these survivors, what they looked like on the ship sailing from Spain to Italy. I quote the translation from Netanyahu. One might have taken them for specters, so emaciated were they, so cadaverous in their aspect, and with eyes so sunken. They differed in nothing but the dead, except in the power of motion, which indeed they scarcely retained. What followed in Abravanel's life could comprise a lecture series of its own. He then served the King of Naples, establishing again so firm a fellowship that he even accompanied the king into political exile. And throughout Abravanel's travels in Italy, Corfu, and elsewhere, he wrote, composing a trilogy on Jewish messianism, a commentary on Deuteronomy and the rest of the Pentateuch, a commentary on Maimonides' Guide, a commentary on the Haggadah, and more. For Netanyahu, it was his messianism that dominates Abravanel's post-expulsion life, sustaining the Jewish people at a moment of terrible challenge to their faith, and imbuing a mysticism on Jewish eschatological expectations forever. But Eric Lowy, an excellent Abravanel scholar, notes in a fascinating article that in fact some of the most important aspects of his post-expulsion writing, including Abravanel's commentary on the Torah, these writings do not have Abravanel's focus on messianism. So messianism is part of his heritage here, but it is not the only part. And indeed, it is today through his biblical commentary that Abravanel looms largest in Jewish thought and study. In 1503, Abravanel arrived in Venice and fell in love with the political system of the Republic. He put his political genius to mediating an agreement between Venice and Portugal, and so successfully served the Republic that when he died in 1508, a remarkable funeral took place. Netanyahu describes how, quote, since under the laws of Venice the burial of Jews was prohibited with the city, his body was taken for interment at Padua, but he was given the last honors by the leaders of the Republic, as well as by leaders of his own people. It was an irregular ceremony, he writes, but most suitable in this case, for it symbolized in a way the dual course, the national, the political and the spiritual, the national and the international, which Abravanel had followed throughout his entire life. End quote. Thus, the man who experienced so many ninth of Avs in his life died honored by Venice, as Mordecai and Esther were honored in Persia. Again, another embodiment in his life and career of Christian admiration for Jews. But we know what followed in Venice. For several decades later, it is Venice who will give Jewish history another word: ghetto. Any Purim moment in Jewish history can be followed by a Tisha B'Av. But the more Jewish exile endured, the more Abravanel's writings and faith loomed in Jewish study and Jewish history. Thus, as we evaluate Abravanel, a question is presented to us. Yes, Abravanel served kings in Portugal, Spain, and Italy. But if in the end, for Jews, it's his writings, his Torah commentary, his theology that endures, what exactly do we celebrate about him as a Jewish statesman? There is, of course, much to say here, but I would like to focus on two aspects of his legacy. First, even when Abravanel interpreted the Torah, he did so, even out of power, always as a statesman. Indeed, he is the only great Jewish exegete to do so. Abravanel seeks not only to explain prophetic and scriptural stories, but to tease out their political implications, to analyze the political philosophy of the Torah. In my own class that I give in Yeshiva College on biblical ideas in American democracy, I show my students Abravanel's commentary on the Torah reading known as Yitro, where Moses at his father-in-law's guidance installs political leaders at all levels of society. Abravanel interprets those passages unlike any other exegete. He sees it as a series of local and national legislatures that is akin, in the desert, amongst Israel, to the Venetian system, except that unlike Venice, the leaders in Israel for Abravanel are chosen by popular vote. One thinks for a moment when you read about local legislatures and a national legislature, all chosen by popular vote, when you read this in Abravanel, one thinks suddenly that one is reading Madison's Federalist 51. And indeed, I have called Abravanel the first Federalist. Now, I'm not saying that Abravanel is an American political figure. He's a man of his time. But still, his commentary is utterly unlike anything else in Jewish tradition, because even when he is a scholar, he never stops being a statesman. And throughout his work, he cites not only the Talmud and Jewish tradition, but also Seneca and Cicero. He was translated widely by Christian scholars and should rightly be considered one of the fathers of political Hebraism, of a tradition in the West of looking to the Bible for political instruction, and intellectual movement that ultimately so profoundly impacted America. And today, ladies and gentlemen, one of our most important tasks as intellectually engaged Jews is to look to the Torah for political insights. And therefore, whether or not we agree with a particular explanation on a passage, Abravanel, the only statesman to write a commentary on Tanakh, is the man who has taught us to see the Torah through political eyes. But even more importantly, an appraisal of Abravanel's political legacy begins and ends with the profundity of his faith. As Netanyahu notes, Abravanel had three separate positions in life. He was a statesman in Gentile courts, he was a leader of the Sephardic Jewish community, and he was a Torah scholar par excellence. Often, Abravanel engaged in these roles separately in different moments of his life. And that's understandable because when one is engaged in court, one doesn't have the ability to write a commentary on the prophets. But in my mind, the moment that all three of these roles truly merged was when he stood before Ferdinand and Isabella, and Abravanel, when he was asked to stay, to convert, and was offered wealth, power, influence, and comfort, he spoke of the eternity of the Jewish people, and he said, no. Today, in the hindsight of history, with the reverence we rightly have for Torah figures, it is easy to see Abravanel's decision not to convert as a foregone conclusion, to paint Abravanel as a saint who didn't care at all for power and influence and wealth that he had acquired. There were many rabbis, but the truth is there were many rabbis in Spain who could have served as his role model had he so wished. Abravanel could have been a spiritual rabbi of a community, like Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet in Barcelona, Rabbeinu Asher in Toledo in the past. That is not who Abravanel was. That is not what satisfied him. Again and again, he desired to serve at the center of power. This means that Abravanel was not without ambition, because no statesman is without ambition. No man who achieves vast fortunes in Portugal and extraordinary success in Spain, and then upon experiencing disaster puts himself at the service of the rulers of the Italian states. No statesman does all this if he's lacking interest in attaining importance and influence. Abravanel is, of course, not the first rabbi to experience exile. But this is not the tale of Nachmanides, who upon expulsion from Spain goes on his solitary trip to the land of Israel. This is instead the tale of an exile who knows that he is a political genius, and he makes himself indispensable to government wherever he goes. This is a man who longs to wield power, to be a Jewish statesman. And thus, the critical question facing a Jewish statesman is, when the statesman is forced, the statesman who desires power, when the statesman is forced to choose between power on the one hand and faith on the other, what choice does the statesman make? We know what choice Abravanel made. He not only refused to convert, but he proudly spoke of Israel's eternity before Isabella herself. We do not often ponder the extraordinary nature of his choice, but consider the other prominent Jews in the court of the king. Abraham, Senior, first among them, Mayor Melamed also. They in the end submitted. They refused to give up their lives in Spain. Abravanel was no less valued in the court. There is little that would have been denied him had he stayed. To him was truly offered that which only in theory seemed a possibility to Esther. Lihimalet Beit HaMelech mikol haYehudim, to take refuge in the house of the king, as many Jews suffered, as long as he denied his identity. Abravanel's own grandfather had made that choice in less dire circumstances. It was the king himself and the most important cardinal in the land that served as the Catholic sponsors at the conversion of Abraham Senior. The honor Abravanel would have experienced from the king is beyond our imagining. But with all on the line, and with the most powerful monarchs in the world asking him to convert and take a place of honor beside them, Abravanel said no. And that one refusal proved his faith in all about Judaism that he believed, all about Judaism that he had told the Spanish queen. Think, ladies and gentlemen, what it would have meant for Sephardic Jewry, facing the greatest challenge to their faith and their lives in their community history, had Abravanel also agreed to convert. Abravanel giving up everything for his faith was the last act that occurred at the hand of a truly Jewish statesman on Spanish soil, and we remember it forever. What Netanyahu wrote about Abravanel's messianism after the expulsion can, I think, truly be said about Abravanel's last moments as a political actor in the court of the Spanish king. Quote, Abravanel lost the political battle for his people, and his struggle on their behalf in the courts of kings and magnates was, as he said, wasted effort. But Abravanel also fought for his people's soul, and in this struggle he won a complete victory. End quote. All too often we honor statesmen for what they do, but in fact it's often what statesmen refuse to do when in the public eye that more truly defines their legacy. Menachem Begin, for all that he did, would often cite his refusal to fire back on the Altalena as Jews were shooting at him as the most important moment in his life, because when he said no to Jews shooting at Jews, that prevented civil war. Here, Abravanel, with the eyes of Spanish Jewry upon him, and the other Jews at court abandoning their identity, Abravanel was asked to convert, and he said no. Abravanel may have initially hoped to save the Jews, and perhaps even to rectify thereby the standing of the name Abravanel in Spain. But in the end, few know of the Christian convert, Don Samuel Abravanel. But Isaac Abravanel's Jewish loyalty hovers over his entire legacy and lives on forever in the Jewish historical imagination. As indeed it must have lived on in the minds and hearts of the Jews who were his peers, who accompanied Abravanel into exile, and those of their children and their children's children. Several summers ago, I flew down to Florida in order to attend the wedding of a young man. The groom's family lives in Spain. They hail from Morocco, and the ketubah, the wedding document, read at their canopy, had some slight variations from the text that I was used to, because it was the version used by Jews of Morocco and Gibraltar, who had utilized this text for over 500 years since the expulsion from Castile. It was a special ketubah known as the ketubah of the exiles of Castile. The other difference, aside from the text, was that in this tradition the ketubah was not read under the canopy, it was sung to highlight joy at their union. So the family had a rabbi from Spain record a version of his singing the ketubah text. It was my job to do it at this wedding, and for weeks all I did was listen to the ketubah and then sing it to myself wherever I went. I studied the text, I learned the tune, I'm on the subway, I'm singing the ketubah of the Jews of Castile. And I had to go up and sing it in Florida before hundreds of people, and ladies and gentlemen, I nailed it. The ketubah, as I was singing it, concludes with the following words. V'hakol k'fi minhag v'atnai shenagu v'shitkinu kilat HaKodesh hamegurashot mikastilla Hashem yishmor nishmatam v'yachon v'yarachem asher hitpleitatam. All has been performed according to the traditions and laws of the holy community that has been exiled from Castile. May God keep their souls safe and bestow grace and mercy on the remnants of their exiles. And I stood there singing this ketubah, and I thought to myself, here we are, celebrating a Jewish marriage, marking a joyous moment, using the same tunes and words of the exiles of 1492. Over 500 years ago, Ferdinand and Isabella expelled their ancestors in the name of ensuring the eternity of their empire, and now their empire is gone. Ferdinand and Isabella are gone. And the Jews they expelled reflected the Jewish ability to build new homes after old ones were demolished, to create holiness in a new land after they were exiled from the last, to move on to consolation and rededication after destruction, and thereby prove every word of what Abravanel had said in the presence of Queen Isabella. It is not too much to say that every time the ketubah of Castile is read at a Sephardic wedding, Abravanel lives again. Because in the choice he made, he showed that he truly believed what he said to the Queen, that an eternal people always outlasts its enemies, and that Jews, who were experiencing a Tisha B'Av of Jewish history, were nevertheless certain of Purim's yet to come. The nighttime reading of the Megillah in Buchenwald that Rabbi Lau describes took place in 1945, a little more than a month before liberation from Patton's Third Army. The Jews reading the Megillah that night had little idea that Hitler's regime was about to collapse and that the Nazis would no longer dominate Europe. But, Rabbi Lau writes, quote, the morning after the restrained holiday celebration, the Jews went out at dawn to forced labor. Some had trouble walking. Those who stumbled were buried in the snow, or else the Ukrainian guards beat them on the head with the butts of their rifles so they would never get up again. The same Jews, he writes, who told me about the Purim celebration in Buchenwald also spoke about a chassid of Gur named Avraham Eliyahu. He became another one of the heroes of my childhood, one of the figures I recall fondly. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, the type we used to call a real Goliath, powerful and with an unusual personality to boot. Unlike most of the Jews, he had no problem walking to his work upright and with confidence. Instead of leading the line from the barracks, he insisted on bringing up the rear, and the whole way he would support the backs of those who had trouble walking. Avram the Pusher, Avram the Stipper, Avram the Pusher, Avram the Booster, they used to call him in Yiddish. With his right hand he picked up the weak, with his left he straightened the bent, and with his chest he pushed them forward. If he saw one of his fellow Jews sway and fall, he would grab him quickly and give him a push, so that the man would continue walking on his own. Everyone thought of him, writes Rabbi Lau, as a remarkable figure. Even the Ukrainians admired him. The day after Purim Eve, after the reading of the improvised scroll, Avram pushed and saved Jews who faltered as usual. The Ukrainian guard, who had great respect for the tough Jew, could not restrain himself and whispered 2 words in Avram's ear. Hitler kaput. Hitler is done for. Within a minute, writes Rabbi Lau, the announcement spread like wildfire from Avram Eliyahu at the end of the line, all the way to the front. At once the weakest muscleman or the weakest laborer straightened their backs and began to walk unassisted. Someone in the middle of the procession began to mumble, and the others joined in. Arur Haman asher bikesh li abdi. Cursed is Haman who sought to destroy me. Shoshanat Yaakov tzahalav v'samecha. The rose of Jacob resulted and exalted. This is the Purim song. The song of that night, writes Rabbi Lau, returned the next morning, about a month before the liberation. This, he concludes, was the only time the Jews ever sang on their way to forced labor in Buchenwald. To truly have faith as a Jew is to be able to mark Purim in the midst of Tisha B'Av, in the faith of a Purim that is yet to follow, in the faith that we will outlast our enemies because we are eternal people, because of our bond to God. And today, in an age of Jewish prosperity and power, where Jewish political achievement is pregnant with possibility, a statesman will never be truly Jewish without embodying the faith and the loyalty of Don Isaac Abravanel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gladys, can you take over now?
Yes, Sandra. I would like to thank Dr. David Bensoussan for the great speech he gave us. And I would like to thank all of you for listening to our 2 great speakers, Dr. David Bensoussan and Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik. Now, if anybody has any question, please address it to Dr. David Bensoussan. He will be happy to answer you. Thank you. Tammy, you have something to tell us?
I would like to say something. It's a little bit of an aside, and that is, I find that there's so many partial truths associated with the Shoah, with the Jews and of the Shoah, that they went in like lambs to the slaughter, that the German Jews were not aware or didn't see the writing on the wall and waited too long before they tried to get out, and then it was too late. In actual fact, 60% of the Jewish population, which was only 500,000 in Germany, left. And then in the last few years before the war started, the rest of them wanted to leave, or maybe 90%, 80% of the rest of them, but the doors were closed to them. They couldn't get out. There was no place to go. So it's not really fair. 60% left from 1933 to maybe 35, 36, probably 36. And then 37, 38, 39, well, 39, forget it, 37, 38, you couldn't get out. You couldn't go anywhere. A few made it to Shanghai, or to the Dominican Republic. But generally speaking, it was very difficult. So I get very upset when I hear the Jews of Germany didn't see what was happening. You know, they came from a civilized country and they thought this was a passing stage. And in 1936 or 37, when others started to realize that this is getting really serious, especially after Kristallnacht, couldn't go. There was no place to go. And then, of course, the Polish Jews couldn't go anywhere either. Or, you know, Eastern European Jews couldn't go. The Belgian Jews and the French Jews and the Dutch Jews, nobody talks about them. They didn't see what was going to happen, that it was going to spread over Europe. So I get upset with this focus on the German Jews. And I would like to say something about Abravanel, and not really about him as much as about the rabbis who don't sanctify him, who don't claim that he's a saint. I love that, because Judaism is very based on reality, on our real lives, on what's really happening. And Abravanel he was exactly like that. His faith was, he was very logical in his exegesis. He wanted the scriptures to make sense. He resented the fact that he had to lose his acquisitions. He was ambitious, as Rabbi Soloveitchik said. So we know that this man was very grounded in life. And he said his spirituality, he lived a spirituality that was interpreted through life, through living life, you know. And I like that. It's not something something out of this world. It is this world. So I'm glad they don't sanctify him. They show him as a real human being. And I think that makes him all the more Jewish, all the more of a true Jew. That's how I see it.
If I may, for the first part, many Jews in Spain at the time thought that the discriminations went against the new Christians and not necessarily them.
Yeah.
So that was part of the illusion that nothing would spare them, but they would be spared. Number two, regarding Abravanel has had a lot of impact on Jewish communities, mostly about Messianism. Maimonides used to say that Messianic time will be somebody who's just intellectual and perfect and so on. He will become Messiah. And Abravanel says, no, but it's going to be something supernatural, somebody coming from supernatural.
Right.
And therefore, there's going to be this mystical messianism that's born. And many of the researchers think that Abravanel is the one who gave birth to this mystic messianism, as we have Shlomo Molcho, Shafai Tzvi, and many others. And he used to say basically that prophecy, anyway, ultimate that Maimonides used to aspire to, is that prophecy is only possible in a free nation living in its own land, the land of Israel, and not when the Jew overwhelmed by calamities is enslaved to the will of kings. So he wanted to use his political might to help the Jews, and he could not. He was versed into messianism, and he went into some kind of mystical, but without forgetting the land of Israel. So in that sense, I believe that there's a lesson to be learned in terms of how the Judaism evolved, in terms of people waiting for supernatural Messiah to come, and others saying, well, no, we have to work in order to make it come. Shuvu elai ve'shuva, come back to me in Israel, and I come back to you. That will be the interpretation of Isaiah should have.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Sammy, you have something?
Sammy,
I just want to say your introduction, David, was so fitting. You know, it set the tone for the rest of the lecture. So we had one from university professor and one from rabbi, and we had both perspectives. And you're not only a professor, but you're also a historian. Okay, sorry. Thank you.
I did like the fact that you emphasized that it wasn't just a theological conflict, it was a racial one.
Absolutely.
It was basically, and I think that they fooled themselves by trying to tell themselves that this is theological. Eventually, the truth came out. It was racist. It was,
And it was-
your blood is going to contaminate the purity of the Christian blood.
I must say also that one thing, you know, Inquisition, when somebody was arrested, no matter who denounced him, simply all his assets were taken.
Confiscated.
And don't forget that the Jews were money lenders. That's the only job that was allowed to do. And then the Jew is arrested, your debt is erased.
Right.
So, for instance, later on, Jews went to Portugal in 1496. And 1496, the Inquisition was imposed in Portugal. And Portugal Jews were simply thriving very fantastically. When you study exactly what's happening in Portugal, what I studied personally, I came to the conclusion that, you know, the priests start to build monasteries, huge monasteries. They were indebted. They didn't know where to get money from. And then by having Inquisition, then you get the money, you pay your debts. That's part of the action. You know, when it was the time to write the Edict of Alhambra, exiling the Jews, Ferdinand d'Aragon said, why should I expel the Jews? They pay 35% of my taxes. They're loyal citizens. Why do I need that for? He was against. But Isabella was influenced by Torquemada, and she decided the opposite. So it was really, Jews were really assimilated in society from the economical, cultural point of view, and so on. But you also have another darker side, which is simply the theological conflict, which had also some very materialistic side effects also. If you go to Toledo, you enter the great church in front of the Jewish place, you see so many diamonds in the front belonging to the church, and you wonder where they got them from.
Thank you, Dr. David Bensoussan, for the most clarifying lecture. We understand much better from you because you know how your approach to us, you are used to us, and you share with us your tremendous, amazing knowledge about everything. Thank you for the lecture and answering the questions. And thank you all for joining us from everywhere, from Montreal, from Florida.
And thank you, Gladys, for being with us.
And thank you all for joining and for listening. We learned a lot today. Thank you very much, Dr.
I
David.
think Sammy wanted to say something. No, he's not there anymore?
Who would like to say something?
Sammy.
Sammy, you're muted.
Sammy Turani, unmute yourself.
He started.
Okay. Oh, welcome.
How about now? You hear me?
Ah, here he is.
Yes.
Okay. I would like to say thank you for Dr. Bensoussan, because the way he presented the idea, it was main idea that the audience can remember. And that's the main thing of a lecture, short lecture like this. I would like to add that there were contacts between the Babylonian Jews and the Jews in Spain. The Jews of Babylon sent some rabbi to Spain to teach them Talmud and to promote Judaism. The good example is the story of Rabbi Tzadok ben Hanoch, who was sent from Baghdad to Spain, and he was suffered from pirates, but then the pirate wanted to sell him as a slave, but the Jews of Spain saved him, and the Caliph invited him and told him, I want you to stay in Spain to build up a sort of a Jewish community, a knowledge center. And so that was a very nice story to remember. There was a sort of a contact between the Jews of Babylon and the Jews of Spain. And when, after the Jews of Babylon were devastated by the Mongol, the Jews of Spain became the center of Judaism. And that's very important because they produced all kinds of rabbis, philosophies, and good ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Sami.
This happened in Moorish Spain during the Golden Age. In Moorish Spain, it happened 10th century or so. Yeah.
Thank you, Sami. Sami never misses any one of our speeches. And now he joined us from Florida. Thank you, Sami. And he always has something to add to us from his knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you, Gladys.
Anybody else want to say something? Okay, so we conclude.
Where would you say, just a second, where would you say is the Jewish center, the center of Jewish learning and perhaps spirituality in the world today? Do you think it's Jerusalem?
It's getting there
Must be
between
Jerusalem.
the United States and Jerusalem, I would say.
Yeah.
But we never had so many Torah scholars as today in the world.
True.
And
That's
in
true.
Jerusalem, there's some issues socially and so on, but in fact, there's a lot of them. What I see since Rabbi Kook that really had a vision of, reaching land of Israel and studying Torah and so on, from all this new yeshivot, I saw a lot of...
I'm on a Zoom that I'm hosting. No problem. It's going to finish.
Sandra.
All I see is
sorry.
a lot of studying of what has been done, but I didn't see any creativity yet in terms of halachic creativity, philosophical creativity.
Where, in Jerusalem?
In Jerusalem, there's a lot of, in the yeshiva,
But
if universities, you'll see a lot of flourishing analysis of philosophy and everything. In the yeshiva, it's a center of Jewish learnings, but I didn't see any new creativity. Maybe I'm wrong, but from what I can see, they have thousands and thousands of pages of Talmud to go through, and that absorbs a lifetime.
right. There has been, well, there's a new institute, the Hartman Institute.
Yes.
Established by a rabbi from Montreal, Rabbi Hartman.
Yeah.
And I think they're doing wonderful, wonderful work. The thing is that the ultra-Orthodox rabbis are in conflict with them. They try to denigrate the Hartman rabbis because they are, it's a misnomer, but they are called modern orthodoxy, modern Orthodox rabbis. And I love their vision. I love the way they talk and they think and they explain things. I listened to a whole series under Rabbi Orenstein. So excellent. And I hope that they, that they have an influence on Israeli Jews, because so many Israeli Jews think of Judaism. If you're going to be religious, you have to be ultra-Orthodox or Hasidic or something. So they're giving them an alternative, and I think they're closer to what Judaism should be, to me, anyway, I think.
Israel, you have to differentiate in the Haredi world, which is a world closed in itself, and
That's right.
all over the world, like Hartman Institute, many others, who are basically open to the world, to philosophy, to understanding, to modern life, and do not simply enclose themselves in a very, very
That's right.
specific ghetto.
Insular,
Yeah.
cult-like world. Yeah.
I like today what happened. Dr. Sickman and Dr. Shaheen, who studied medicine together, they met each other in our session. And this is what happens every time. Sometimes people are in different countries and they meet through our sessions. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Bensoussan. Thank you all for joining us. It was a wonderful session and enjoyable, and we learned a lot. Thank you to our two wonderful speakers. Thank you, Dr. Bensoussan.
Thank you.
You always join us when we need you. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Bensoussan. Thank you, David.
All wonderful. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Next month it will be March 19. So March 19 on a Wednesday, and we will be all happy to see you and get with you, your families, your friends. We like the more the merrier.
Gladys, speaking of Purim, which we listen to a lot in the rabbi's speech, I'm organizing a in-house event of Sunday brunch. It'll probably be Sunday the 23rd of March. It will be after Purim, but it's a film about Esther, and you're all gonna love it. And we'll have a delicious brunch. So keep your calendars open for Sunday, the 23rd of March. And I'm going to sign out now, and love you all, everybody. So nice to see all your beautiful faces.
Thank you, Sandra. You are doing a great job.
Thank you, Gladys.
All
Thank
this-
you so much, Gladys.
You keep the program alive and even much nicer with everybody from all over the world. Thank you again, Dr. David Bensoussan. We cannot do anything good without you. You are always with us. You are part of the Women Learning Group of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue.
Thank you very much.
You gave us so many speeches, and we always learn from you, and we enjoy your company. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Zygmunt. You were not here when I said I liked when you met Dr. Shaheen, you studied together. That was something that we enjoy always, the meeting, each to meet the other. Sometimes they are in different countries and they meet through our program. Thank you all.
Thank you, Gladys.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Bensoussan, again and again. Thank you, Sami, for joining us from Florida. And thank you all. Bye. We are concluding now. Bye.